Welcome to the second of our Lent videos. Rodney and I have come up to Galilee, to the Sea of Galilee. We're staying at Pilgerhaus, the German pilgrim house here on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where we sometimes come with our pilgrim groups. And the time that we spend with pilgrims here up in Galilee, and especially by the Sea of Galilee, to many of our pilgrims, they tell us it feels like a retreat within the pilgrimage. The pace of life changes up here compared to Jerusalem and some of our other visits. And it gives us a chance to reflect, perhaps a little bit more prayerfully and quietly at times, and then back to Jerusalem for the culminating events that we mark for Holy Week and Easter. And in this video, we're going to be looking especially at the theme of discipleship. We're going to be focusing on some of Jesus's teaching and around some of the ancient sites here at the Sea of Galilee. And we're excited to show you some new things that have been discovered. But the theme of retreat is a little difficult at the moment because we are still in the midst of this terrible, devastating and frightening war which we're enduring here in the land. And so we cannot entirely, and we don't want to, escape that reality that our discipleship call is within the realities of our lives, whatever they may be. And Jesus calls us to follow him, however our life journey is progressing, and to be faithful to that calling. And so we invite you to come with us and to explore these themes and these places.
Hi, I'm Rodney Ace, the course director at St. George's College, Jerusalem. And I'm standing on some church ruins in an Israeli national park, just where the Jordan River goes into the Sea of Galilee. Both pilgrims and biblical scholars are interested to know and to identify the actual biblical sites. Here on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, then there's two sites in particular that Christians have wanted to know where they're located. The first, of course, is Capernaum, which is mentioned 17 times in the Bible. And when the first Western explorers came through the region, it didn't take them long to find a set of distinctive ruins that were identified as Capernaum. You know, certain traditions have been on the ground for centuries, either maintained by Orthodox or Western pilgrims or remembered by the local Arab-speaking Christians. The second place that people would be or should be interested in knowing is Bethsaida, which after Capernaum is the place name most mentioned in respect to Jesus' Galilean ministry. Bethsaida is mentioned 7 times in the Bible. Twice in John, we know that the disciple Philip and along with Peter and Andrew come from Bethsaida. So Bethsaida, we presume, is the place where Peter was born. 2 other references occur in terms of the woes. Jesus ultimately curses Bethsaida along with Capernaum and Chorazim. Jesus did a lot of ministry, healings and teachings in Bethsaida and these 2 villages. The people didn't believe. He ends up cursing them. And then we have 3 other stories. One fascinating from Mark. I don't know if you've ever noticed the detail, but in the Mark's version of Jesus walking across the water on the Sea of Galilee, he sends the disciples in their boats in the direction of Bethsaida. So when Jesus later is walking towards the disciples, yes, to their boat, he's also walking in the direction of Bethsaida. And then there's 2 other miracle stories that one is the feeding of the 5,000. Luke sets that story in Bethsaida. And then another story from Mark that we'll talk about soon is Jesus healing a blind man. A crowd brings a blind man to Jesus in Bethsaida. He takes him outside the village and he heals them. These are the stories of Bethsaida that should make all pilgrims and biblical scholars ask the simple question of where is it located and what does it mean? Now we should also talk about 2 other extra biblical sources or sources that are not in the Bible that are important for us to understand where Bethsaida is or what it means. The first is our first century source, Josephus. Josephus, just in one or two lines, just very simply says that Philip, the tetrarch, Herod Philip, who has the region east of the Jordan River, he endows two particular cities. One is Panias, or we call it today Banias, which is biblical Caesarea Philippi, turning that into a city, the status of a city, and also right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He does the same thing to Bethsaida. He changes the name to Julius, one of the, according to him, the daughter of Caesar. And so when we look for biblical Bethsaida, then we're looking for a place that Philip somehow brought up to the level of a city. So Josephus says both in terms of the number of inhabitants, but also in terms of its grandeur. The second source, which is important, is a 8th century pilgrimage text. It's about the travels of an Anglo-Saxon pilgrim named Willibald. He was traveling through in his early 20s. He's only 24 years old when he walks through the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, and he's our only pilgrim source that talks about a church. He suggests that there's a church built on the house of Peter and Andrew, and he's again the only source that we know. But if we look at the Willibald's text, he's coming around the northern part of the lake from Capernaum, then to Bethsaida, and then eventually to Cursi, which remembers the story of Jesus and the miracle of the swine. So where am I now? I'm actually standing on the church ruins at a place called El Azra. Now, we're talking about where biblical Bethsaida is, and this controversy has been going on for a full 100 years. There's been two sites, both now on Philip's territory on this east side of the Jordan River. They're only a couple of kilometers apart, and so if we interpret the meaning of the story, they basically tell us the same thing, that some of the disciples were born on the east side of the Jordan in a slightly more pagan, Hellenistic area. In fact, those disciples have Greek names, and then they move across the river just a few kilometers, a couple of miles from here to Capernaum. So in terms of our biblical understanding of the movements of the apostles, then these locations tell us the same thing. But in terms of biblical archaeology today, there's a big debate upon where is biblical Bethsaida. As Dean Richards said, we had an opportunity to come up here and to meet our friends at Pilger House who have brought us to these excavations. Let me tell you about the other site first. It's called Etel, which means the hill, the hill, El Tel. It's been excavated since about 1987. There's some wonderful Old Testament ruins there, some also Hellenistic and Second Temple period. One house certainly has been, some fishing equipment has been found. It's a little bit away from the Jordan River, and that's one reason why archaeologists or scholars, various people like yourselves, have said it may not be the site. I'm standing in the other site, again, El Azra, which has been excavated since 2014, even though, as I said, it has been known about for a few decades. What they have found here, they have found a Roman bathhouse, and they have found enough Roman archaeology. But in terms of not just simply walking in the footsteps of Jesus, but in walking in the footsteps of the pilgrims who walked in the footsteps of Jesus, what interests certainly myself is the ruins that I'm standing on now. Remember our pilgrim Willibald, who was here in 724? He's the only one that mentions this church, and it appears, or there's a good argument, that it's the church that I'm standing on or standing beside right now. This is a Byzantine church, so it would have been built at least 100, 150, 200 years before Willibald was here in the 8th century. It's got a single apse. The whole foundation walls have been uncovered. One thing unique about it is they've not found the actual opening or a doorway in there. There's pillars that you can see in the middle. And what was discovered just a couple of years ago, which is just in front of me a bit, below on the ground, is an inscription of a person who dedicated, a certain Constantine who dedicated the church, but then there's a petition to Peter, and that really raises our attention, that a reference to Peter on the mosaics, with the idea that Bethsaida is where Peter is from. If you're able to see that there is quite a bit of water here, we're in the late winter season. The whole excavation is kind of flooded a bit. Once the rainy season's over, when they do excavate here, the excavation team is led by Kinneret College, which is also on the south end of the lake. It will be fully dry as they continue, hopefully, to continue to excavate in the next few years. So you might certainly listen in the news about what happens in terms of our understanding of Bethsaida. What's your opinion if you've been here or if you've read about it? We might have the opportunity of bringing more groups to this site because, again, it's on Israeli national park land. The other thing I want to bring your attention goes back to Willowbud. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm so excited to be here because my academic background are the pilgrims that come to the Holy Land before the Crusades, and Willowbud was actually the subject of my dissertation. So over my years, I've been walking in the footsteps of Jesus, and I think the best way to describe this site is it's the leading candidate for being biblical Bethsaida. It raises the least amount of questions. No, having a Byzantine church doesn't prove that it's the biblical site, but we can certainly say that the Byzantines thought that this was a biblical Bethsaida, and there's just an excitement being here as we imagine both Jesus and then the later pilgrims just walking around the edge of this lake from Capernaum to Bethsaida and even on to Percy, the place that remembers Jesus' miracle of the swine. Now, did you hear the year that I told you that Willowbud was here? He was here in the year 724. This happens to be 2024. We know that he was in the Galilee before he came to Jerusalem, but the text says that he entered Jerusalem on the feast day of St. Martin's. St. Martin feast day is November 11th. It's also Dean Richard's birthday, so put that on your calendar for November. But with our ecumenical partnerships here in the Holy Land in Jerusalem, we've had an opportunity to speak with the German Benedictines in Jerusalem. And why then? Why them? Willowbud was an Anglo-Saxon Benedictine monk. He grew up in a Benedictine monastery as a child. He then journeyed to Rome with his father and his brother. His father died on the way. And then with some other Anglo-Saxons, he came to the Holy Land where he spent 7 years. He ended up going back to Monte Cassino in Rome as a Benedictine monk and then became a bishop in Germany in the St. Boniface Anglo-Saxon mission to Germany. Sometimes in the news report, it'll slightly in error say that a Bavarian Bishop Willowbud was here. He was only 24. He was a young man. He later became bishop. But back to my point, in November, St. George's College is proud to say that we're going to partner with the German Catholic Association here in the Holy Land and the Benedictine Abbey to have a 2-day event celebrating Willowbud's entrance into Jerusalem. We will have a day of lectures and worship, a day of walking the sites of Jerusalem, and in some way, we too will feel that this site will be a part of the program, because this biblical site brings Willowbud into the conversation again. And just to underscore kind of the excitement of this, we can often talk about the uncovery of biblical sites over the last 100, 150 years, and yet that's still going on. Even today in real time, we have these legitimate questions of scholars and biblical pilgrims and biblical scholars asking where biblical sites are. And so coming here, you're part of history, you're part of that recreation and rediscovery of biblical memories in the Holy Land, and we're quite pleased to present this site to you on this Lenten video. We're still at El Arash, about 100 meters from the church. Behind me is the Jordan River. It's late winter, right before the Jordan River empties into the Sea of Galilee. Now, Lent is a journey to Jerusalem, so you might ask, why are we still in the Galilee? Well, Dean Richard and I took the opportunity to come and meet our friends at Pilgrim House to see the excavations here at Bethsaida. But it also allows us to look at these stories through the frame of Lent. And indeed, the story I'm going to talk about now, which comes from Mark 8, in the same chapter, Jesus is predicting his death. And so we know this journey of Jerusalem to Jerusalem is beginning. He goes up to Caesarea Philippi, which is north of here, but already, even here, Jesus knows what's ahead for him. The story of Jesus healing the blind man at Bethsaida, again from Mark 8, is unique in all the healing stories, for it takes place in two phases. A crowd brings a blind man to Jesus, and then Jesus leads him alone outside the village of Bethsaida. He spits and rubs the spit in his eyes, and then Jesus asks, "Do you see anything?" The question Jesus asks is, "Do you see anything?" The blind man looked up, and then he said, "Yes, I see people who look like trees walking." And then Jesus put his hands on his eyes again. He fully healed him. And the scripture says that his eyes were opened. His eyes were opened. It's a fascinating story because, as I said, it's the only time that we could say it didn't work, or I think a better interpretation is a healing of phases. And even in this last couple of weeks, I've heard more than one person interpret that story in terms of a kind of a metaphor of our own spirituality. So let's think about Lent. You could think about us being the blind man before we ever meet Jesus, before that Lenten journey. And then part of Lent is Jesus asking you, do you see anything? Do you understand what my ministry is about? Do you understand what it means to be a disciple? The sense of Lent is asking ourselves these questions. And even though the blind man didn't see fully, he had some recognition that things were, he could see, but he couldn't see. Yes, he could see people, but they were like trees. They were still like objects. It wasn't a full sense. The story wasn't a full sense of knowing what he was seeing. The story moves on quickly, but our invitation of processing this story as a Lenten story is to stay right there in the middle phase. For us, we can imagine, if we want to think of Lent in terms of personal spirituality, here is Jesus taking the man by himself away from the crowds to do this healing as we think about our own personal relationship with God. Jesus is asking us once again, having followed him to this point of all the healings and miracles and teachings, do you see anything? What is it at this point of the journey do you see? And perhaps more importantly, as difficult it is, what are the blind spots? What is it in our love for other people, our compassion, our daily walk that's difficult? Perhaps things that we don't see, and how do we see if we can't see? Later on in that story, where it says that his eyes were opened after Jesus touched him the second time, it's the same words that we get in the Road to Emmaus story from Luke 24, when the travelers and Jesus were around the table, Cleopas and his companion. Jesus breaks the bread, and his eyes were opened. Our eyes are opened at Easter with the resurrection, with a new understanding, a new life, a second chance, a redemption. But here at Bethsaida and on our Lenten journey, perhaps sometimes Jesus just simply asks the questions, do you see anything? What do you see? What are the blind spots? Oh, you see people, but they look like things. Are we treating people like things, like objects? How are we treating ourselves with self-care? What is our relationship between God, self, and other? That's the middle of the story. That's the phase here at Bethsaida where we should just wait in these 40 days of knowing that our eyes are not fully open, but we do see and we can reflect, and we will eventually meet Jesus in Jerusalem.
Welcome to the ancient site of Chorazim, which is a few miles up from the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. And at the beginning of that shot, you may just have made out in the distance the beautiful blue of the lake spanning down to the south. And Chorazim is not one of the biblical villages that we generally have on itineraries of St. George's College study pilgrimages, because there are so many places to go, and this is just one small one. And it barely features in the Gospels. And when it does get mentioned, it's not in an especially wonderful way, because Chorazim is one of the villages that Jesus curses, along with Bethsaida, where we have just been, and Capernaum, which will be known to almost every, if not every, pilgrim that has been with us to the Holy Land. But here Chorazim is perched above the Sea of Galilee, and it's been well excavated and is interesting for many of its features here in the way that it has been excavated. And we often tend to avoid the more doomy type of things that Jesus says. We, in our contemporary times, tend to focus more on the positive messages. Jesus' message of love, forgiveness, and mercy with justice. But we cannot simply focus on the passages we love and like and that reiterate that positive messages. We have to look at the entirety of the gospel, even the bits, maybe sometimes especially the bits that make us feel uncomfortable. And there is such a profound challenge in the gospel, and that's often what we focus on in Lent. It is a time to think about the things that we should and must avoid, identifying the things in our life, individually and corporately, which do not measure up to the expectations and the challenge of Christ for us as Christians following in the way. And it reminds me very much of the teaching of one of the great heroes of Christian history, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which, as we're spending time amongst our German friends, is the great towering example of Bonhoeffer from the early pre-war period through the 30s and 40s. Bonhoeffer, who courageously opposed the Nazis from the basis of his Christian faith. And perhaps his best known book, The Cost of Discipleship, contains such a challenging message, condemning cheap grace and commending costly grace. For Bonhoeffer said that cheap grace is forgiveness without repentance, or grace without discipleship, where costly grace, the true grace that comes through discipleship, demands of us that we leave behind the things which do not conform to the love and goodness and justice of God, and challenge us to live in the way. So Jesus' condemnation and throwing a curse upon these villages is also important for us to focus on, and perhaps now in Lent is a good time. He curses them for hearing but not believing. And we should beware for ourselves of being aware of the challenge of the gospel, but failing to apply it in our own lives. It's so easy to point to the failures, perhaps the sins of others, and not to see that in ourselves. Now in Lent, we're asked to know the things that we are called to avoid, and to walk towards the things that are holy and good and true. Jesus talks, after the Beatitudes in Luke's Gospel, pronounces the woes. Woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who laugh. Woe to you who are comfortable. But then goes on to commend the love and grace of God. So Jesus does not stay for long in the things which are cursed and condemned and judged. For in the end, the message of the gospel, which is proclaimed so powerfully for us ultimately in Easter, is the message of love over hate, of joy over woe and sorrow, of peace over warfare. And in these tragic days of war and starvation, we are called to stand with those who suffer in prayer and action, to be signs of hope. May you have a holy Lent and come to the foot of the cross and the empty tomb, ready to hear the call to discipleship.